8 months. That is how long the internet had completely unsupervised access to a story that had no new information, no official statements, and no actual basketball to anchor any of it to reality. 8 months of conspiracy theories built on draft picks and coaching changes. 8 months of accounts that have never stepped inside a professional locker room, constructing elaborate power struggle narratives with the confidence of people who had actually been in the room. 8 months of manufactured outrage recycled from timelines so aggressively that the noise started to feel like news. And then, without a press conference, without a carefully worded PR statement, without a single post optimized for engagement, Caitlin Clark walked through the doors of Gainbridge Fieldhouse, laced up her signature sneakers, and turned one single training camp practice into the loudest statement any player has made before a regular season tip-off in recent league memory. If you are a Caitlin Clark fan who is tired of the noise and ready for the real analysis, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. Because what we are about to break down today is everything the internet got catastrophically wrong with Clark, Raven Johnson, Stephanie White, and the Indiana Fever organization, and exactly what Day One reveals about what this team is genuinely capable of doing this season. There is a lot to unpack here. None of it looks anything like the panic narrative that dominated your timeline this week. And by the time we are done, you will understand not just what happened on that practice floor, but why it happened, how it was always going to happen, and what it means for every team that is going to have to share a bracket with Indiana when the games that actually matter begin. To understand the full magnitude of what Clark pulled off on Day One, you have to start where the story actually begins. Not with the draft, not with the coaching change, with her body and what she was carrying physically when she walked back into professional competition after a rookie season that extracted an enormous physical price. Clark's first year in the league did not end with a single dramatic injury moment. It ended the way the most damaging athletic injuries always do, through accumulation. Groin issues that built quietly through the mid-season stretch, a quad sprain that layered on top of a foundation that was already compromised, ankle problems that completed a sequence of compounding soft tissue damage in the lower body that no amount of individual game-by-game management could fully prevent. Every injury she absorbed was the direct product of a specific and documented defensive strategy that teams had identified early and committed to for the entire season. The calculation opposing coaches made was not complicated. Caitlin Clark was the lone offensive engine for a franchise that did not yet have the surrounding roster depth to distribute the physical burden of an 82-game professional season. Target her, make every single possession physically expensive, apply relentless contact, crowd her on every drive, make her feel the weight of every screen, and trust that the cumulative damage would eventually show up in the fourth quarters where games are decided. It worked, not because Clark is fragile, but because no player on earth is built to absorb that volume of physical targeting alone across an entire season. The body keeps score, whether you acknowledge it or not.
What makes her physical situation walking into training camp genuinely significant is not just the injury list. It is the medical reality of what cascading soft tissue damage in the lower body actually does to an athlete during recovery. The visible healing, the point where a player clears the medical staff and is technically certified as ready to return, is not the finish line. It is the beginning of a second and far more subtle phase that almost never gets discussed in sports coverage because it does not show up in injury reports. The body develops unconscious protective mechanisms during the rehabilitation process. Fractional hesitations in movement patterns, tiny adjustments in weight distribution during explosive lateral cuts and first-step accelerations. Almost imperceptible changes in how a player loads their plant foot before changing direction at full speed. These compensations exist below the conscious level of the athlete. They cannot be willed away. They show up on detailed film review weeks and sometimes months after the physical healing is technically considered complete. And for a player whose entire offensive value is built on the kind of explosive first-step quickness, rapid direction changes, and clean shooting mechanics that come from precise lower body function, any measurable version of that protective hesitation would show up immediately in the quality of her game. Almost every player who has returned from that volume and variety of compounded soft tissue damage has shown some measurable version of rust in their initial practices back. It is not a character flaw, it is biology. The expectation walking into that Gainbridge Fieldhouse was not that Clark would look bad. It was that she would look like a world-class player who was still finding her full rhythm after a difficult physical year. That expectation was reasonable, it was analytical, it was based on everything we know about how elite athletes return from that category of injury. She showed zero rust, not a single moment of it, not one fractional hesitation, not one shot where the footwork looked like it was being managed rather than executed, not one possession where her first step carried even the faintest echo of a body still in conversation with its own recovery. What she walked through those Gainbridge Fieldhouse doors with was not luck, and it was not simply exceptional genetics. It was the direct product of exactly how she chose to spend the months between the end of her rookie season and the first morning of training camp. And to understand that, you need to understand what she was actually doing during those 8 months, while the internet was constructing its theories. Let's get something straight about the FIBA World Cup qualifiers in Puerto Rico, because the way those games have been covered drastically undersells what they actually represented for Clark's return narrative. These were not a soft reintroduction to competitive basketball. They were not a controlled rehabilitation exercise designed to ease her back into game-speed action at a pace her medical staff could carefully monitor. They were full-intensity international competition against elite, physically organized opposition, played on a timeline that would have been ambitious even for a player who had spent the entire off-season completely healthy. Clark did not treat them like a rehab assignment. She treated them like exactly what they were, a high-stakes competitive environment that demanded her full investment. Against Senegal, a defensive unit specifically calibrated to collapse on ball handlers and apply maximum physical pressure to every possession, Clark posted 17 points and 12 assists in 19 minutes of playing time, connecting on 4 of 5 attempts from beyond the arc. Pause on those numbers for a moment, because the context around them is what makes them genuinely extraordinary. 19 minutes. That production rate does not just exceed what anyone had a rational right to expect from a player still technically working through a recovery timeline. It breaks the analytical expectations for a fully healthy player operating at the complete peak of her game. You are talking about a points per minute rate and an assist volume that would lead the statistical conversation for any player in the league, regardless of health status. In 19 minutes, against elite international physicality, after compounded soft tissue injuries that would have ended lesser athletes' seasons 6 months earlier. She walked out of Puerto Rico as the undisputed FIBA tournament MVP, not as a participant, not as a contributor, as the best player in the tournament by a margin that the statistics reflect clearly and that anyone watching with honest eyes could see without needing a spreadsheet to confirm. And then she took every ounce of that international confidence, every shred of that tournament MVP validation, and carried it directly into the most media-scrutinized training camp the WNBA has ever produced. That is not an athlete trying to find her footing. That is an athlete who used her off-season to build the kind of competitive foundation that does not crack when the pressure and the cameras and the conspiracy narratives are all pointed directly at her simultaneously. By the time she stepped on that Gainbridge Fieldhouse practice floor, she had already answered the physical questions. Day 1 was about answering everything else.
Now, let's get into what the conspiracy crowd was actually arguing, because you cannot appreciate the scale of how definitively Day One dismantled those narratives without understanding the specific claims that had been running across WNBA social media for the past week. The dominant theory, pushed with remarkable confidence by accounts that had zero insider access and zero analytical framework to support their conclusions, was that Indiana's front office had engaged in a deliberate and structured campaign to quietly diminish Clark's role within the franchise, to transition her from the generational point guard who had single-handedly transformed the commercial trajectory of the entire league into a perimeter specialist operating within a more rigid system that would ultimately limit what she could do on the floor. The evidence cited in support of this theory came in two specific pieces. First, the draft selection of Raven Johnson, a defensive guard, which the conspiracy crowd interpreted as an organizational signal that the front office intended to install a different primary ball handler alongside Clark. Second, the coaching change that moved Christy Sides out and brought Stephanie White in as head coach, which was framed as the organizational infrastructure of a deliberate plan to impose a system that would prioritize structure over Clark's instinctive, free-flowing playmaking that makes Clark functionally impossible to guard when she has the ball in space and the freedom to make decisions at full speed. That the new coaching philosophy would be the mechanism through which the front office achieved its alleged goal of repositioning Clark within the offense. Day One delivered the most efficient possible answer to that specific argument. Clark ran the offense completely and without constraint from the opening possession. Full point guard control, total freedom to push transition pace, make reads at full speed, and operate exactly the way she operates when she is at her most dangerous and her most unguardable. The coaching staff did not rein anything in. There was nothing to rein in. There was only basketball being executed at a level that makes interference counterproductive for every single person present on that practice floor. When you are pushing the transition game at a pace that leaves defenders gasping before they can establish position, finding backdoor cutters before the cutters themselves have finished processing the decision, delivering no-look passes through windows that appear physically impossible until the ball is already through them, and pulling up from 35 feet with the quiet certainty of someone who has made that exact shot so many times that the difficulty of it has become irrelevant to the mechanics of the execution. You are not requesting the keys to the franchise. You are demonstrating, calmly and without drama, that the entire conversation about the keys was always fictional. The keys were never in question. Only the people watching from the outside convinced themselves that they were. Here is the historical context that every person who spent the past week constructing power struggle narratives fundamentally failed to account for. The WNBA is 30 years old. In that entire history, the league has never produced a player who combines Clark's passing vision, shooting range from distances that literally redefine what the three-point line means as a tactical concept, the ability to read the court at full transition speed in ways that process information faster than most defenders can react, and the commercial gravity she generates simply by being in a Fever uniform on a basketball floor. Every one of those elements individually would make a player exceptional. The combination of all of them in one athlete at 25 years old, with a full prime still ahead, is without precedent in the league's three-decade history. The conspiracy theories about limiting her role were not just analytically wrong about basketball strategy, they fundamentally misread the financial and competitive reality of what Clark represents to this franchise and to the broader league infrastructure that depends on the growth she is actively driving. You do not limit the asset that is generating the commercial expansion of your entire organization. You do not quietly reposition the player who has single-handedly changed the economic conversation around professional women's basketball in this country. You build around her. You protect her. You make absolutely certain that everything surrounding her is good enough to maximize what she is capable of producing. And then you let her play basketball and trust that the basketball will answer every question that the noise cycle tried to make seem complicated. That last point is where the real story of this training camp actually begins, because the roster Caitlin Clark walked onto on day one is not the roster she was forced to carry alone through her rookie season. Every single move this organization has made during the offseason has been constructed with one architectural purpose so clear that it is essentially written into the contract structure itself. Give the most talented player in the league the surrounding infrastructure to compete for a championship. Not just make the conversation compelling, but actually compete for a ring in a way that makes every other front office in the league look over its shoulder and wonder whether they moved fast enough to keep up. Let's talk about what Raven Johnson actually looked like on that practice floor, because the real court reality of her day one performance was the single most decisive piece of evidence against the entire conspiracy framework, and it was delivered in the quietest, least dramatic way imaginable. Johnson was not running the point guard position while Clark stood frozen on the wing, waiting to be fed the ball in a limited role. She was not directing offensive sets. She was not operating as a second primary ball handler, competing for the role that defines Clark's value to this offense and to this franchise. She was doing exactly and precisely what a point-of-attack defensive specialist is drafted to do. Applying relentless physical pressure on the ball, bringing a gritty physical dimension to a perimeter defense that had been statistically exploitable throughout Clark's rookie season, when teams could isolate matchups and run action against Indiana's weaker defensive personnel. Competing with the kind of intensity and physicality that transforms a defense from something opposing teams can scheme around into something they have to genuinely prepare for and respect. And she did all of it without a single visible moment of intimidation. She walked into the most media-saturated practice environment in WNBA history, with cameras pointed at every interaction between her and Clark, with every WNBA account in existence waiting for footage that would confirm the narrative of tension and competition and locker room conflict that had been promised all week, and she just did her job, professionally, quietly, effectively, without giving the drama machine a single frame to work with. The WNBA discourse spent 7 consecutive days constructing an imaginary hostile locker room, a cold, barely functional relationship between two guards fighting for the same oxygen and the same role, an explosive first-day confrontation that would confirm every whispered theory about front office sabotage and organizational dysfunction. The actual practice floor delivered 2 elite professionals operating in complementary roles, communicating through screens, competing hard in scrimmages, and producing absolutely nothing that the drama-farming accounts could weaponize into the content they had already promised their audiences. Aaliyah Boston said it with complete precision on her podcast before camp even opened. Fans and media always carry far more conflict into these situations than the actual players do. She was correct. She was 100% correct. Clark ran the offense. Johnson disrupted on the defensive end. The roles were specifically designed for each other, and day one confirmed that the design works exactly as intended. Now let's examine what this roster structure actually does to opposing defensive coordinators when they sit down for film sessions before a game against Indiana, because the financial commitments embedded in these contracts tell a very specific story about how Clark's second season is going to operate at the possession level, and that story is a nightmare for anyone tasked with stopping it.
Start with Aaliyah Boston, because the pick-and-roll partnership between her and Clark is already one of the analytically least solvable offensive actions in the modern WNBA. Boston locked in on a 4-year, $6.3 million extension, the largest financial commitment to a front-court player in Indiana Fever franchise history. When she sets a screen at the level, the defense faces an immediate sequence of choices, and every single available choice is bad. Go over the screen and give Clark a full downhill runway to the rim where she is finishing at an elite rate and drawing fouls at a frequency that accumulates across opposing big men across a full season. go under it, and hand her a pull-up 3 from the logo with clean feet, no hand in her face, and all the time in the world to let her mechanics take over. Switch and put a perimeter-sized defender in the unenviable position of trying to guard a player locked in to $6.3 million, who averaged double figures and played with the physical IQ of a 10-year veteran throughout Clark's rookie season. None of those options produce good defensive results. All of them generate above-average offensive outcomes for Indiana on a statistically consistent basis. Kelsey Mitchell waiting on the wing as that pick-and-roll action develops is the secondary punishment mechanism that makes the entire offensive structure mathematically oppressive for opposing defenses. Mitchell averaged 20.2 points per game last season and returned on a $1.4 million Supermax deal. Any team that collapses 2 defenders towards Clark at the level of the screen is explicitly choosing to leave a player who averaged 20.2 points standing in open space without a contest. Mitchell does not function as a secondary option in those possessions. She functions as the primary beneficiary of every defensive overcommitment that Clark's gravity creates, and opposing coaches know that, which means every time they are drawing up their defensive coverage for a Clark and Boston pick and roll, they are simultaneously trying to solve the problem of leaving Mitchell open. There is no defensive scheme that solves both problems at the same time. The math does not allow it. Sophie Cunningham's addition to this backcourt configuration is the most analytically underrated move the Fever made during the entire offseason. Not because of her scoring numbers, which are real and which make her a genuine threat that defenses cannot simply ignore, but because of what her presence communicates to every player in the league who spent last season treating the physical targeting of Caitlin Clark as a viable and consequence-free defensive strategy. Teams had identified a documented pattern during Clark's rookie year: apply consistent, accumulated physical pressure across 40 minutes, make every drive uncomfortable, make every mid-range pull-up a contested physical event, make every possession carry a little extra cost, and trust that the compounding fatigue shows up in her decision-making and shot selection in the fourth quarter, when the games that actually matter in a playoff race are decided. Cunningham's presence sends a deterrent message that no play designer can scheme away from. The calculus on cheap shot fouling changes when the player on the other end of the roster has a history and a reputation for physical enforcement. That message does not require a single on-court incident to be received and understood. The roster listing itself communicates it clearly enough. Lexi Hall shot 47% from three-point range in lineups that featured Clark last season. That number is not a coincidence, and it is not a statistical anomaly. It is the direct output of what Clark's gravity does to opposing defenses at the structural level. When Clark has the ball in space, defenders have to make a choice between their assignment and rotating to stop her. When they choose Clark, which the vast majority of them do because the alternative is giving her a clear lane to the rim or a clean look from 30 feet, they leave their man. Hall was on the receiving end of that math repeatedly last season. The same dynamic scales up with every additional shooter this roster adds around Clark, and this offseason roster construction added several. Monique Billings provides the vertical rebounding physicality that sustains offensive possessions in the half-court sets where modern WNBA playoff basketball is ultimately decided. The grinding possessions, the second-chance opportunities, the offensive rebounds that extend sequences that would otherwise die, those separate teams in close series in a way that never gets adequate attention in the regular season narrative, but becomes obvious when the games have no margin for error. Myisha Hines-Allen brings championship-caliber post-passing and the kind of high basketball IQ from a position that almost never produces that quality of offensive creation at the professional level. Her ability to make reads out of the post and find the open man before the defense can recover adds an entirely different layer of offensive threat that opposing defensive coordinators have to account for in their preparation. Tasha Harris provides the veteran backcourt stability that keeps the offense functional in the stretches when Clark needs rest, and the team cannot afford to have its entire offensive structure collapse in her absence. That depth was a weakness last season. It is not a weakness now.
And then there's Justine Pellington, 6'4", 42% from three-point range in college, a floor-stretching presence whose combination of size and shooting range forces defenses into structural compromises that benefit every single player sharing the floor with her. When a 6'4" player can punish you from the arc, you cannot shade your help defense toward the paint in the way modern defenses depend on to contain elite ball handlers. The entire defensive scheme has to be reconfigured to account for her, which means more space for Clark, more space for Mitchell, more clean looks in the pick and roll for Boston. Pellington is not just a rookie with impressive measurables, she is the organizational signal of a franchise that is not building for one season, not chasing a single playoff run, but investing deliberately and intelligently in the complete window of Caitlin Clark's prime years. And the roster construction reflects exactly that timeline in every single contract commitment and draft selection it has made. Here is the analytical dimension of this story that is receiving almost no attention in the broader coverage, and it is arguably the single most important factor shaping what Indiana looks like when the regular season actually begins. Caitlin Clark is not returning from injury as a player who is grateful to be back and relieved that the worst is behind her. She is not returning as a player who has had time to reflect and arrive at a mature, measured perspective on the criticism and the noise. She is returning as a player who absorbed 8 consecutive months of disrespect narratives without a single public response. Narratives that questioned her power within her own franchise. Narratives that questioned whether the coaching change had been specifically designed to work against her interests. Narratives that questioned whether her rookie season was going to be retroactively dismissed as a product of novelty and commercial momentum, rather than the genuine elite-level talent that produced it. She absorbed all of it. She processed none of it publicly. She did not tweet through it. She did not give the long-form interview where she addresses the speculation with careful diplomatic language. She did not do any of the things that the sports media environment is designed to incentivize players into doing when the narrative around them is moving in a direction they disagree with. Instead, she went to Puerto Rico and won a FIBA tournament MVP against international competition. And then she walked into Gainbridge Fieldhouse and played basketball that made every single one of those narratives look embarrassing in retrospect. That choice to respond with performance rather than words is not a small detail in the psychological profile of what this team is going to look like this season. The chip on her shoulder entering the regular season on May 9th is not a media construction designed to add narrative texture to a story that is already compelling. It is the natural and inevitable psychological consequence of an entire offseason built around the premise that something fundamental had shifted against her within her own organization. Every player who has ever had their competence, their influence, and their organizational standing questioned publicly for 8 consecutive months, and then had the opportunity to answer with their play rather than their words, knows exactly what kind of fuel that creates. It does not dissipate over the course of a regular season. It compounds, it accumulates, it shows up not just on day 1 of training camp, but in the fourth quarters of playoff games when the margin for error is 0, and the motivation required to make the play that wins the series has to come from somewhere deep enough to survive the exhaustion of a full professional season. Nothing about the organizational power structure shifted against Caitlin Clark this offseason. The basketball confirmed it on day 1. But the months of manufactured narrative that insisted it had gave her something that no coaching staff, no front office decision, and no roster upgrade can manufacture. It gave her a reason that goes beyond competitive excellence, and that reason does not fade when the regular season grind gets difficult. Let's put everything together and talk about what this actually means for the Indiana Fever's ceiling this season.
Because when you stack the complete picture, the physical recovery that produced zero rust on day one, the FIBA Tournament MVP performance that confirmed the body is not just healed, but operating at an extraordinary level, the roster construction that removes every structural weakness that opposing teams exploited last season, the psychological fuel that 8 months of disrespect narratives inevitably generates in a competitor of Clark's caliber, and the organizational coherence of a front office that has clearly been building toward a specific destination rather than just reacting to circumstances.
You are not looking at a team that sneaks into a playoff conversation. You are looking at a team that arrives at the bracket having spent an entire regular season making opponents feel like they were perpetually underprepared for what Indiana brought to the floor every single night. Every defensive coordinator in this league is going to spend film sessions this season staring at a version of this problem. You cannot stop Clark at the point of attack without leaving Mitchell open on the wing. You cannot collapse on Clark without gifting Boston in the pick and roll. You cannot shade your help defense toward the paint without opening up Pellington behind the arc. You cannot physically target Clark the way teams targeted her last season without Cunningham communicating very clearly that the calculus on that approach has changed. There is no defensive scheme that solves the complete problem of what Indiana is presenting this season. There are only bad choices and less bad choices. And the team on the other end is led by a player who is operating at a level that makes the bad choices look catastrophic and the less bad choices look merely insufficient. The preseason opener against the Dallas Wings on April 25th is the first public pressure test. Not the full picture, but the first concrete piece of evidence beyond training camp about whether Stephanie White's rotation decisions reflect the promise of day one, or whether the new system creates early friction before the roster fully coheres around its identity. The regular season tips off on May 9th. By that point, every piece of the analytical picture we have been building today will be tested against game conditions, against real defensive game plans, against the kind of physical pressure that only actual professional competition at full intensity can generate. The bold prediction goes on the record right now, clearly and without qualification. This Indiana Fever team is going to shock the entire basketball world this season. Not because of anything communicated in a press release, not because of a coaching philosophy memo that the front office distributes to the media, not because of the commercial machinery and the cultural attention that surrounds this franchise in a way no women's professional basketball team has ever experienced before. It will be because Caitlin Clark, fully healthy for the first time since her rookie season began, fully motivated in a way that 8 months of silence and 9 months of accumulated competitive drive can uniquely produce, and surrounded by the deepest and most carefully constructed roster of her professional career, is about to operate with a combination of internal fuel and external weaponry that this league has simply never seen concentrated in one place at one time. The teams that spent the offseason paying attention to the noise instead of the basketball are going to feel that gap when the schedule puts them across from Indiana. The teams that built their defensive game plans around the version of Clark that was physically compromised last season are going to spend the first month of the regular season recalibrating in real time while the scoreboard tells a story they were not fully prepared for. And the accounts that spent 8 months constructing elaborate narratives about front office sabotage and organizational dysfunction and locker room power struggles are going to spend the season watching the basketball make every single word of it look exactly as disconnected from reality as day one suggested it was. Caitlin Clark walked into Gainbridge Fieldhouse and answered 8 months of noise with one practice. The regular season is going to answer every remaining question with something a lot louder and a lot more permanent than anything the internet spent the offseason saying.